time, and I started out as an installer. I had a shop where I did AC installations and kind of started working with Vintage Air and the R&D aspect of it, and I've been there full-time now for almost going on 20 years pretty quick here, so I've been around for a while. And we do a lot of these seminars, and you'll notice in your outline that this seminar is more directed towards education, the basics of AC, more than it is product-oriented. There is some product stuff if we get to it, but I want to make sure, again, you can get that product information. What we're trying to do here is give you some information on the basics of aftermarket air conditioning, okay? Kind of going to go through this, but first thing I want to start with is it's really critical to understand a couple different things about air conditioning. The first thing that's important to understand about any air conditioning system is the fact that it is a system. That it is a system made up of components that have to work together to make it work satisfactorily for you. You know, that's in that respect, it's no different from a brake system or anything else. You know, you can have the latest 14-inch calipers and 14-inch rotors and 6-piston calipers on your brake system. And what happens if you use the wrong master cylinder, wrong bore master cylinder? It doesn't stop, right? You know, you got a car that doesn't stop right, even though you've got some of these really good stuff. So it's the same way with air conditioning. It's a system, okay? And I tend to start off with this picture. I saw this on the internet a while back, and you know, it's one of these things where I think one of these days I'm going to run into this guy somewhere. But he's probably not a hot rodder. So, but you look at this and you know, you wonder what this has to do with air conditioning. But you know, we can make the best components in the world of Vintage Air, but in the end, it all comes down to the guy doing the installation. You know, that cap's a pretty simple piece, has a lot of R&D in it to keep the sun out of the guy's eyes, you know, but if it comes down to the guy doing the installation, it isn't doing what it was supposed to do. You look at his buddies here, they kind of got it figured out. They've got their hands in their laps, they're having a beer, they're having a good time at the game. And this guy, a little different. So, in the end, that does relate to air conditioning because it does come down to proper installation and paying attention to the basics. And if you do that, an air conditioning system has to work. It's just physics. It's not rocket science, it's not a black art. It's just physics. If the right components are installed properly and charged properly, the system's going to work for you. Okay? I'm going to start here and go over some of them. We're going to talk about just the basic components and what they do, and then we'll kind of relate that to system operation. Okay? The second thing that's really important to understand with air conditioning is how it works. It is not a system that makes cold air. The way an air conditioning system works, you take any enclosed area, be it this room, be it your car, be it your house, you're pulling warm air in through a blower, you're running it across the coil, and when you run that air across the coil, you remove the heat from it, and then you blow that cooler air out on you. So the air you feel is air with an absence of heat, is what you're doing. And why it's really important to kind of get that set in your mind is the best air conditioning system in the world, again, won't do you any good if you don't have your vehicle sealed and insulated well. Makes sense, right? You know, I live in South Texas. This weather's kind of a shock to me. I was up in Boyne City yesterday. It was minus 18 in the morning. It was 80 degrees at home on Saturday. I come up here, it's minus 18. My son's 18 now, but when he was younger and hadn't learned a few things, you know, it's 100 degrees in South Texas. In the summertime, you know, we got air conditioning in our homes. But doesn't matter how good that air conditioner is, it can't air condition South Texas. So if the windows and doors are left open in the house, the air conditioner ain't going to cool it, right? No different than your vehicle. If you don't seal and insulate that vehicle well, the air conditioner can't work. If you're letting hot air in the vehicle quicker than the AC can remove the heat from that air, you aren't going to be happy. And we see this all the time. I go to a lot of shows, do a lot of seminars and things, and run into this. We all get a guy that'll tell me the first sign I'll hear is, you know, I'm going slow around the parking lot, it's going okay. And then I get out on the highway, and it's just not cool anymore. And we go in, so we walk out and we take a look at the car, and it's not sealed, and it's not insulated. And we'll take a ride, and again, I might just well roll the windows down the way he's got hot air coming into that car. Again, if you're bringing hot air in quicker than the AC can cool it, you won't be happy with the performance. And that's what it comes down to. So one of the biggest tips I give everybody to make their air conditioner or heat work better, seal and insulate the vehicle. If you don't seal and insulate the vehicle properly, it ain't gonna matter how good it is, you know? When it's 0 out there or whatever the heck it is out here today y'all are dealing with, if you ride around with the windows down, best heater in the world is not gonna keep you warm. Same thing with that air conditioning system, okay? And all of these diagrams are in that little handout I gave you there as well. So this is something you can kind of throw in your toolbox or throw in your library. There's a lot of good information here, okay? The 5-minute basic on how an air conditioning system works is we're taking a refrigerant and we're running the refrigerant through the system. And that refrigerant changes states twice, okay? It evaporates from a liquid to a gas, and when it evaporates from a liquid to a gas, it absorbs heat. And when it condenses from a gas to a liquid, it dissipates heat. So what we're doing is inside the car, we're absorbing our heat, and then we're carrying it outside the car and dissipating it. So we're not really, this goes back to your basic physics. We're not really creating cool or destroying heat. We're just grabbing the heat from inside the car and taking it outside. And we're doing that by using a refrigerant for it, okay? These are the basic components of just about any aftermarket air conditioning system, all right? You've got a compressor, a condenser, which is usually in front of the radiator. You've got lines. You've got a receiver dryer, a safety switch, an expansion valve that goes to your evaporator, and then back to the compressor, okay? And we're going to talk about each one of those components just real quickly here, okay? Your compressor is nothing more than a pump. All that compressor is it pumps refrigerant through the system. Okay? When you engage it, you start the pump pumping, and when you disengage it, you stop it from pumping. Most compressors have an electromagnetic clutch on the front of that compressor. And until you put 12 volts on that clutch, it's just an idler pulley. So one of the common questions we'll get from a dealer or from a customer is, I just installed air conditioning in the system or in my car. Is it okay to drive it until I get it charged? And the answer is yes, as long as you don't engage that clutch. Again, that compressor has a sealed bearing in it, and it's nothing but an idler pulley. Okay? Once you engage the clutch, now you start pumping the refrigerant through the system. Okay? And when you start pumping it, that compressor compresses the refrigerant. You get a high pressure gas that goes into the condenser, and that condenser is nothing but a heat exchanger. That's all it is. That's a heat exchanger. You're taking the heat from the refrigerant that you absorbed inside the car. You're running it through some tubes. Refrigerant transfers the heat to the tubes. The tube transfers the heat to the fin. The air going across the fin is what takes the heat away from the refrigerant, okay? Just like a radiator, same thing. It's just a heat exchanger, all right? As we cool that refrigerant, you cool it, it goes from a gas and it condenses into a liquid. Okay, so coming out of your condenser, you've got a high pressure liquid that goes into your receiver dryer. In the receiver, I'm going to take these components now, take them out of the car, and just put them out so you can see them a little easier outside the car. Okay? We've got our condenser. See the air going through the condenser. As the air goes through it, it takes the heat, condenses that gas to a liquid. Now, from the condenser, we're going to go into our receiver dryer. And the receiver dryer does several different things for you in the system, okay? First thing it does is separates liquid from vapor. And that's a fancy way of saying we want to make sure we have nothing but a high-pressure liquid going to the inside of the car, going to your evaporator. You see a cutaway of your receiver dryer here. You'll see that it has an in and an out. The dryers are directional. When the refrigerant comes in, you'll notice there's no tube here. It goes in and drops down through the filter pads and into the bottom of the dryer. When the system's properly charged, the refrigerant level, the liquid level in your dryer is about halfway up. And that's one of the things the dryer does for you. The hotter it is, the more heat you're trying to absorb inside the car, the more refrigerant you're going to use. So this dryer is a storage canister for your refrigerant when you have times of high demand. So normally, the liquid level in the dryer is going to be about halfway up. You'll notice the out of the dryer, the outside of the dryer, has a tube at the bottom. Basically, this dryer is kind of working like a milkshake. You know, if you have a milkshake, what happens if you start pulling that tube out of your milkshake as you're drinking it? Pretty soon you're not getting milkshake anymore, right? What are you getting? Air, right? Okay? Same thing in the dryer. And where that comes into play is another common question you'll ask is it real critical to the angle that the dryer sits? And the answer to that is you've got about 30 degrees you can tilt that dryer. Now you can see the reason why. As long as you keep that liquid level above that tube, you're going to be pulling liquid out of there. You've got that liquid seal just like you do in your drink. You start laying it on its side, now all of a sudden you're not pulling liquid anymore, you're pulling vapor, and that's not what you want. So that's the second thing it does, is it gives you a liquid seal and ensures that you have liquid refrigerant going to the expansion valve. All right? Third thing it does is filters the refrigerant. It's got some filter pads in it that filter out any impurities in the system. And what that filter is going to catch is things like you've got a compressor that has some pistons that are moving back and forth, so you're going to get wear, so you're going to get some wear off those piston rings and everything. And that's what that dryer will do. It'll catch that little bit of debris in the system. The third thing the dryer does is that dryer portion, the receiver dryer name, is it removes any moisture that might be in the system. If there's a small amount of moisture left in the system. When you have a refrigerant in the system, you want it to be pure refrigerant. You don't want any moisture in there for it to work properly. So these dryers have what's a desiccant in them. You know, if you buy a stereo or you buy a TV or something, you have those little white filter packets, those little packets in there. You say desiccant on them. Say desiccant, do not eat. You know, you ever wonder about that? You know, did somebody eat one of those to begin with, and that's why they had to write that on there in big letters, do not eat? But that's the same thing that's in a receiver dryer, is that desiccant. Okay? And that desiccant will absorb any of that moisture that's left in the system. Okay? So that's what it's done. Another question you'll get fairly often is, do I have to change this receiver dryer? Because since it is a filter, people ask that like your oil filter. And the answer to that is no. As long as you haven't opened your system, that dryer will last a long time. Because it's a closed system. You're not bringing any outside air into that system, so it's fine. Right? The only time you'd have to change a dryer from a maintenance standpoint is if you have, you know, in the industry they call it a catastrophic failure. If you have a compressor or something like that go away. Anytime you open the system, I put a new dryer in there. Okay? Because you got a good fresh dryer that way to absorb any moisture that's in the system. With that in mind, when you're putting a system together on a car, you don't want to leave that dryer open because that desiccant is not smart. It doesn't know moisture in the refrigerant from moisture in the air. So if you live in a real humid environment like it can be here in the summer times, if you leave the dryer open while you're working two, 3, 4 days or a month or however it is long to take to build your car, you're going to get that moisture absorbed from the air, and now that dryer is not going to be able to do its job in the system. So you want to keep it capped until you're basically ready to do the system assembly so that you got a good dry, fresh dryer. And our dryers all come charged with nitrogen so that they're a nice, clean, dry dryer. Yes, sir. We'll talk about that because when we talk about that, he asked the question, how does the dryer tell the difference between the oil that circulates through the system and moisture? The oil that circulates through the system is mostly dissolved within the refrigerant. So it's carried within the refrigerant. So that's how it tells. And the molecule sizes are much different as well. Yep. And the desiccant won't absorb oil. It will absorb moisture. It's designed to absorb moisture. All right. Yes, sir. That's an interesting question. That's if you can reclaim a dryer. You know, years ago when I was doing AC, I had a guy tell me that, yeah, you can. What you do is you put it in the oven and bake it at 350 degrees for an hour and a half, and all you end up with is a mess in your oven and an old dryer. For what a dryer, that's basically a throwaway part. I mean, you wouldn't reclaim an oil filter on your engine unless it has, a removable filter. And it's the same way with a receiver dryer. Once that desiccant absorbs the moisture, there's really no good way to get the moisture back out of it in a component like this without having to pull it all apart or something. So for the price of a dryer, they're throwaways. Nah, not get everything out of it, no. They're cheap. A basic black dryer is less than $30. A painted dryer. I mean, you can get chrome ones for 50 or 60, aluminum ones a little higher than that, depending on. But even the aluminum ones that we have a replaceable element on them and stuff. So there's ways to replace just the actual dryer element and not have to replace the entire dryer. That's a good question. Yeah, once a dryer's been opened and stuff, they're throwaways at that point. Okay.
So when you do the install, the dryer should be relaxed.
Yep. If you're a car builder, if you're playing around with cars and stuff like that, what I'll do is, and we keep them around the shop, I'll send them out every now and then, is just have a mock-up dryer. If you have an old dryer, if you replace a dryer on a car, don't throw it away. Put a piece of tape on it, write mock-up on it, And that's your dryer for when you're doing all your hoses and making up all your lines and everything. Use that dryer there when you're getting ready to install the system for the last time. Put the fresh dryer in there, and you're ready to go. But I always have a mock-up dryer laying around. That's just a good thing to have. Okay? Any other questions on the dryer? Because that's really an important part of your system operation. Now, location. This dryer doesn't care where it is between the bottom of the condenser where you have the high-pressure liquid and the expansion valve on your evaporator that we'll talk about. It can be anywhere in this high-pressure line. Right at the condenser or inside the car, right at the evaporator. What are we trying to do with our condenser? Get rid of heat, right? We want that refrigerant to be as cool as it can going back into the car. So you keep this in mind when you receive a dryer. Any of our SureFit kits that are kits designed for specific vehicles, you notice when factory air kind of became more common in cars in the 60s, where was the dryer mounted most of the time? Core support, right? Right next to the radiator and the core support. It was mounted there because it's in the airflow. You know, you've got liquid refrigerant in your dryer. If you have cool air blowing across it, it's going to help take that heat out of that refrigerant. What you don't want to do, you've spent this whole time in this condenser getting rid of that heat that you absorbed inside the car. What you don't want to do is put more heat back in the dryer. Don't mount it right next to your header or somewhere really, really close to the engine in the car, because all you're doing is heating up that refrigerant. We want that refrigerant as cool as it can be when it gets inside the car so we can absorb the heat in there. So on a later model car, if you've got a large enough grill area or you've got a place like that, put the dryer outside where it's in the airflow. On a 32, something like that, obviously that's a whole lot harder thing to do. On a hot rod, pre-48, I'll generally put the dryer inside the car up in the kick panel area. It's hidden, it's out of the way, you don't even see it, and it's in a cooler area, so you're not absorbing all that heat out under the hood. So it's a good thing to keep in mind is, and it's a simple when you think about it, you want to keep this refrigerant as cool as it can be when it gets into the car. So keep it as far away, and the hoses as well. Any of your refrigerant lines, you want to keep those away from exhaust or keep those away from any hot area. On an older, like a 39, I've got a 39 Ford, I'll run all my hoses out in the wheel well area and then up into the kit. Keep them right from underneath the hood. Keep them away from that heat. You want to keep that refrigerant as cool as you can after you've gotten rid of the heat in the condenser. Okay? Yes? On a SureFit kit, they do. On a system designed specifically for a car, for most pre-48 installations where it's universal components, we sell a universal hose kit where you can cut the hoses, put the fittings on, crimp the fittings and all that, and run them however you want. And the reason that comes into play is, most pre-48s, you're not dealing with a factory type installation. My 39 Ford's got a small block Chevy in it. The next guys might have a small block Ford, So you've got a lot of differences. Our SureFit kits are systems that are designed specifically for vehicles. They start with about like a 55, 56 Chevy and then up through the 60s. Because in those cases, pretty much the column's set where it's going to be. The engine's in a specific location, the radiator, things like that. So you can design a kit with specifically crimped and hoses and hard lines and all of that, because in most cases, you're not redesigning the wheel on those cars. The column's where it is, and most of it, the pedals are where they are and all of that. So we have specific kits for those. The pre-48s, you tend to get into, there's a little more, there's some different options on a pre-48. You're deciding where that column is going to go. You're deciding where that brake pedal is going to go. You're deciding where some of those are, okay? Okay, from the dryer, we're going to go through the safety switch, compressor safety switch. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I want to move on to the evaporator. And the evaporator is the unit that's under your dash inside the car, okay? And that's called the evaporator because that's where the evaporation occurs. That's where your heat absorption occurs, okay? Going into that evaporator, we have an expansion valve. And the expansion valve is this brass valve you see on the inlet to your air conditioner. The evaporator is what everybody calls the air conditioner. That's the part inside the car. That's the evaporator. This expansion valve, what the expansion valve does is meters the amount of refrigerant going into your coil, is the first thing it does. The second thing it does is atomize that liquid refrigerant. And what you can kind of do is envision this high pressure hose. If you got a garden hose, right, and you take that garden hose and you turn the water on full blast, if you just leave the end of that hose open, what are you getting coming out of there? You're getting a hard stream of water, but it's just a hard, heavy stream, right? As you take and squeeze your thumb down on there, what happens to that hard stream? it atomizes, right? You start getting a spray. You want to try a little experiment on how an air conditioning system works. It's real easy to do on a hot summer day. Take your hose and do that and kind of hold it up in front of your face with that mist. You ever done that before? You start feeling cool, don't you? What you're doing is those atomized water droplets are evaporating, and as they're evaporating, you're absorbing heat, so you feel cooler. You know, if you go to a restaurant, a lot of them have misters around the place, and you know enough that are dropping mist on you and it cools it off. That's basically what an air conditioner does. So now you've got that high pressure refrigerant going to go into that coil, and that expansion valve is making it a spray. You've got basically droplets of water that are going to circulate through this coil. As those droplets of water circulate through the coil, we're grabbing the warm air in the car, pushing it across the coil. That warm air evaporates those little droplets of refrigerant, and as they evaporate, they pull the heat out of that air. So the air that you've got coming out of that coil now is colder air because you've taken the heat out of it. Now, as you cool down air, you get a byproduct of that. Colder air holds less moisture, right? Again, we got basic physics. Colder air holds less moisture. So not only now are you getting a cooler air coming into the vehicle, you've got less humid air. You've taken the humidity out of that air. So that's the other reason that you feel much more comfortable with an air-conditioned situation, is you've also taken the humidity out of the air as you've cooled it. Now, what's humidity? It's water, right? I mean, humidity is nothing but water. So with your air conditioner, as you take the humidity out of the air, that humidity becomes water droplets. Those water droplets drop to the bottom of your coil, and there's a tray, and then they go out through a tube out underneath the car. So, you know, when you pull up at a stop sign or you stop at a 7-Eleven or something like that in the summertime, it's a hot, humid day, and you get out of the car, and there's a big old puddle of water under the car, right? That water is the humidity that was in the air that the air conditioner is taking out of the air. And that's why it's so important to make sure you hook up that drain line from the bottom of your AC unit, or you have real cold, wet feet on that side of the car. But that puddle of water you see is the humidity that was in the air. So that's what we're doing with that evaporator, okay? So now we've got those water droplets that have evaporated. They've absorbed that heat. You're going to pull them now out of the evaporator coil through this suction line into the compressor, and then we're going to compress that, push it out to the condenser, and start the whole process over again. So what we're doing is we've just got a closed loop system where we're going through evaporation to absorb heat, condensation to dissipate heat, right? And then, again, just continually cycling it. Now, all our systems are set up, all our aftermarket systems are set up so that they draw air continually from the inside of the vehicle. They're not a vent and outside air inlet. They're inside the car. And now that you see how the system works, you see why that's much more advantageous, because every time you circulate the air through this system, what's it do? It gets colder, right? It gets colder and it gets drier. So that air is going to feel better every time as it goes through that. All right? Okay, questions on that so far? I could throw more terms at you. Yes, sir. The blue line represents suction. That's the low pressure side. Yes, that's gas. That's a low pressure gas. And the red is a high pressure gas. So the blue is the low. You know, when you talk about the high side and low side of a system, everybody's heard high side and low side of an AC system, right? The dividing line is the expansion valve. The high side of the system is everything from the discharge side of the compressor, where this is all red. That's a high pressure gas. Now you're condensing it to a high pressure liquid through the receiver dryer. Still a high pressure liquid till we go through that squeeze down, that little atomization. And now we become low pressure, which is the suction side of the compressor. So you've got a high side and a low side, and your dividing point is that expansion valve at the inlet of your evaporator, okay? And you notice this refrigerant has arrows, how the refrigerant flow is. And to touch back on the dryer just for a second, there's an inside and an outside of the dryer, okay? We talked about that. The dryer says in. One of the common things I see also with people is when they see in, they put that to the inside of the vehicle. And that's backwards. In is the side that's coming in from the condenser, and then out goes to the expansion valve. Right? Yep, all of our systems that we have right now are expansion valve systems. Yes. Yep, and we'll talk about cycling just a second, next to talk about. Yep. And there's certain reasons for that. An expansion valve is a really efficient way, and it's a good way to meter the amount of refrigerant. You don't want it any closer than about 1/8 of an inch. You don't want it touching, because you get back to that same thing about heat transfer. What's the best heat transfer? Touch, right? You know, kid learns that real easy. Hold your hand over the stove, it's pretty warm, right? When you touch it, it gets warm real quick, because you're transferring that heat. So you don't want to have that extra heat of that condenser right against the radiator because you're transferring that heat, but you don't want it so far away that it's easier for the fan to pull around it, which is what a shroud helps you do. But you want your condenser about 1/8 of an inch or so, and again, some of that's determined by packaging, how much space you have in the car and everything, but you don't want it touching if you can avoid it, but you don't want it so far away that it's easier for the fan to pull in between the two. You want that fan to pull through both of them. All things being equal, push pushes for what, fan? Like engine, like fan in front of the condenser? Oh, I mean, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I mean, you know, you want, a polar fan's always more efficient than a pusher, always. A polar fan is always more efficient when we're talking about fans here. A polar fan is always more efficient, and you're not blocking the radiator with a pusher either. Now, you know, electric fan versus engine-driven fan, you know, I'm kind of an old school guy. I used engine-driven fans for years. But you got to look at the technology of electric fans, you know. The old electric fans were not all that efficient. But you know what drove the change on electric fan efficiency? Packaging inside late model vehicles. When the engine stopped being longitudinal and turned sideways, now all of a sudden we didn't have that good engine-driven fan anymore. We had to have an efficient electric fan if we're going to make that work, and a shroud. So it was incumbent upon the OEMs at that point to develop, and the aftermarket to develop much more efficient electric fans. Back in the 80s when I had my shop and I was doing installs, very rarely did I use an electric fan because they weren't that efficient. Now, the electric fans that are available now, much more efficient. It depends on the blade. I mean, the S-blade versus the straight blade, it depends on the design of the actual blade itself. Some of the S-blades are more efficient. I've seen some straight blades. An S-blade is usually more efficient. It's a little quieter. You know, but the great thing about an electric fan is, number one, it's only on when you need it, and it's most efficient when you need it the most. Think about an engine-driven fan. When's the time you need the fan the least? Going down the highway, right? You know, when you're going down the highway, you're getting plenty of ram air through there. Well, at that point, your engine-driven fan is spinning the fastest. Now you're in traffic, or you're riding around the fairgrounds, you need that airflow, and what are you usually doing at that point? You're idling, right? So your engine-driven fan, an old guy like me, the engine-driven fan that I used to love so much, it's the least efficient at the time you need it the most. So that's why an electric fan is a good, electric fans have gotten better and better. With a shroud, that's the way to go. You know, and you only use it when you need it, it's the most efficient. Okay? Yes?
What's a good temperature drop across the condenser?
About 30 degrees. You should get 30 degrees temperature drop across the condenser, all things being equal. Yeah, you want to get, if you're not getting 30 degrees temperature drop, you're not going to get enough. Okay? Any other questions before we kind of move on a little bit? I could bring up other terms that you've heard for air conditioning, you know, superheat and a whole lot of that, and it'd put you to sleep more than you are now, and it's not going to help you understand how the system works. Big critical things to keep in mind, again, and I'll say them again before we finish. Absorbing heat from inside the vehicle, dissipating it outside the vehicle, okay? State changes. Gas to a liquid, liquid to a gas. Liquid to a gas, absorb heat. Gas to a liquid, dissipate heat, okay? So that's what we're doing. We're moving that heat from inside the car, moving it to the outside of the car, okay? And that's what the system's doing for you. Again, this is not magic. It's not a difficult system. If you take the right components and you install them properly and you do everything you're supposed to, the system has to work. It has to. Again, it's just physics, okay? All right. Now, we're going to give a quick talk now about compressor cycling that you talked about and what a system does. All right, so we've talked about what we're doing. Another thing to keep in mind with an air conditioning system is the oil in an air conditioning system circulates within the refrigerant. So as you're circulating refrigerant through the system, you also have oil dissolved in that refrigerant. And that's what helps lubricate the compressor, and that's what helps lubricate other portions of the system, other parts within the system. Okay, your expansion valve and other parts within the system. So with that being said, if you lose refrigerant, what else do you lose? Oil. Okay? If you lose oil, what happens to any system? It don't work real well. Okay? So it's important that we don't run that compressor if we lose refrigerant. Okay? So that's what we're going to talk about here. The way your system works is, in most cases, when you turn that system on, crank it on, now we're putting 12 volts out to this compressor clutch. That compressor clutch is going to engage, and we're going to start pumping refrigerant through the system, as we talked about, okay? We're pumping that refrigerant through the system, and as we pump it through the system, we absorb the heat inside the car. We take that humidity out of the air. That humidity turns into water droplets. They drop to the bottom of the case of the evaporator and drain out through the drain line, all right? The more times we circulate that air through the system, as that compressor continues to pump it through the system, what's going to happen inside the coil here, the temperature inside the coil? It's going to continue to drop, right? If your car's well sealed and insulated, if the temperature of that air is going to continue to drop, right? Now what happens when we get that temperature in that coil below 32 degrees? What happens to those water droplets? They freeze, right? Okay? Everybody's heard about air conditioning freezing up, about an AC system freezing up. What happens in an air conditioning system when it's frozen up is the coil temperature, your system's working so well, now your coil temperature's got down below 32 degrees. And in a real humid environment, you got a lot of humidity in that air, right? So now that droplet, instead of being a water droplet, becomes an ice crystal. And it's no different than building a snowman. How do you build a snowman? You don't start by gathering, you take a little snowball and you roll it around in the snow, right? And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the same thing can happen in your AC coil. What you get is you start getting a cold spot in the coil, you start getting an ice crystal. And then it builds, and it builds, and it builds. So what you can do eventually is you can turn this entire coil into a block of ice, literal block of ice. Now once that's happened, you can't push air through it, right? You can't push air through ice. Or if you're not pushing air through that coil, you can't absorb the moisture and absorb the heat out of it. So the air's not going to feel cold anymore. If you've got a system that's frozen up, generally what you'll feel, and the term is used a lot, in a lot of cases it's not correct. If you have a system that's frozen up, the first way you can tell that system is frozen up is your airflow out of your ducts, out of your vents is going to drop. Because instead of that air going through this coil and flowing out through those vents, it's hitting that, and it's having to go around a little bit. So you've got a blower that's running on high, but you're not feeling much air. You're just hearing a lot of noise because it's cavitating, okay? And in that case, that's your first indication that the system's frozen up, right? The only way you can unfreeze the system at that point is to turn it off. Now you stop the compressor pumping, you stop moving refrigerant through the system, the temperature inside your coil comes back up above 32, that ice melts, you get a big old rush of water out there, and you can start again, right? Then you can turn it back on and start again. But who wants to do that when you're driving down the road? You know, you want to be cool for a while, and then have to turn the AC off till you get warm again, and then start all over again? That's not what we want to do. So what we do is we cycle the compressor, which we call cycling the compressor. And so what we do is we have an adjustable, in most cases you have an adjustable thermostat that's got a little capillary tube, a little silver capillary tube that goes down inside that coil. And you can adjust that thermostat to the coil temperature that you want. What you want to do, even on the hottest days, you want to keep that coil temperature about between 33 to 37 degrees. So that when the temperature gets to about 32, 33 degrees, that thermostat breaks its contact inside, kills the power to the clutch, the compressor shuts off for a few seconds, temperature of the coil goes up to about 37 degrees to keep that water in a liquid form. Then the points of the thermostat come back together, give power back to the clutch, and now we start pumping again, and then we're going to bring that coil temperature. So you're going to have your coil temperature fairly constant, between 32 and 37 degrees, to where you're not going to really feel that coming out the vents. And that's what we're doing when we say we're cycling the system to keep it from freezing up, right? So certain things determine how you can run that. Number one is humidity. If it's obviously you're in the desert, there's not a lot of water in the air, you have less problems with freeze up than in a more humid environment. The other thing that's real critical to that is sealing and insulating the vehicle. If you have a lot of hot air and a lot of humidity around that evaporator that you're pulling into it constantly, you're going to get more water, right? I've looked at so many cars for people that say they're really well heated or really well insulated, and I'll go out and look at them. They've insulated the floor really well. And I get up under the dash and I look and I see a bare cowl. Or I see a firewall with 2 or 3 holes in it that are right there in front of where the evaporator is. I'll tell you a good way to test how well your car is sealed up as far as holes. Take a bright fluorescent light, just a good shop fluorescent light, throw it up under the dash in a dark garage, shut the doors of the car, and shut the lights off in the garage. And then raise the hood and watch your firewall or watch the floor. Anywhere you see white light coming out, that's an air leak. And you can do the same thing the opposite way. Put it under the hood, put it on the floor, and get inside the vehicle and look for light. Anywhere you see light is a potential air leak. Very commonly, I'll get in there and find a car that the guy says is sealed up real well, and you'll see the master cylinder seal is gone. So now you've got about 1.5 inch, 2-inch hole right around the master cylinder that's leaking all that hot air from under the hood in there. And that's going to increase your chances of freeze up because you're bringing more hot air in there. Right? So we're cycling the compressor to keep the system from freezing up. All right? Any questions on that? Yes? It is. It's a manual adjustment in most cases. In some of our, in some of our later model systems, like our Gen 4 system, it's all done by the microprocessor. In our Gen 2 systems, our Gen 2 series, it's a manual control for your thermostat. In our Gen 4 series, like the SureFit series that we have most of them, it's all handled electronically within the microprocessor, the Gen 4. It automatically keeps that coil temperature between about 36 and 40. You don't even have to adjust it. So there's 2 different control systems for that. Right? Okay, now let's talk about safety switches. You know, we talked about the thermostat. When you engage the thermostat, turn the system on, you've got 12 volts coming out to that coil clutch coil. All right? We talked just a second ago about there being oil dissolved within the refrigerant. So if you lose refrigerant, what else do you lose? Oil, right? We lose oil, that's a bad thing. Compressor doesn't run long without oil, just like your motor won't run long without oil. So in the old days, we used to have what was called a low pressure safety switch. That 12 volt signal that was going to that clutch went through a low pressure safety switch. So if the pressure in the system got below 30 psi, that switch internally separated, and it wouldn't allow that 12 volts to go to that compressor. So that saved you from burning up a compressor if you lost your refrigerant charge. Right? That was called a low pressure safety switch. We also, again, we talk about this compressor. What's a compressor? Pump, right? It's not a smart pump. It doesn't know unless you tell it to do something. So if you just engage that compressor and you keep running it and running it and running it, it just keeps building pressure. If you're not getting rid of the heat in this refrigerant, what happens to a gas the hotter you get it? What happens to the pressure in it? It goes up, right? I mean, that's just the higher the temperature of the gas, the higher the pressure is. So if you're not getting rid of that heat, that gas keeps getting higher pressure, and now you've got problems. You can start blowing lines off. You can start having all kinds of issues with your compressor. It's bad. So we used to have what was called a high pressure safety switch. So that the pressure in the system, refrigerant pressure, got above about 410. It had internal switches that would break internally, and it would shut the compressor off until that system pressure went back down, then would re-engage the compressor. So that was a high pressure safety switch. Okay? So back in the R12 days, you had 2 separate switches. Finally, the industry combined those 2 functions into a single switch, which is called a binary safety switch. You know, a bicycle is 2 wheels, a biplane is 2 planes, 2 wings. With a binary safety switch, that gives you low pressure protection and high pressure protection. So the very bare minimum, if you have an engine-driven fan on your system, you need a binary safety switch to protect your compressor in your system. That way, if the system pressure gets above 408, it's going to shut that compressor off until your pressure goes down, and then it'll allow it to re-engage. And if you lose refrigerant, that'll keep you from burning up the compressor. So a binary safety switch gives you high pressure and low pressure protection for your system, all right? If you're running an engine-driven fan, again, that's what you need. Now, if you're running an electric fan, like we talked about earlier, as your primary engine cooling fan, you need a trinary safety switch. What's a tricycle? How many wheels? 3, right? Okay, trinary safety switch is just simply a binary switch with an added function of a fan engagement. At 254 psi, when your pressure gets to 254, that switch says, uh-oh, we're not getting enough airflow across this condenser to get rid of the pressure. We need more airflow. What gives you more airflow? Fan, right? Turn on the fan. If you're running an electric fan, you need a trinary safety switch in your system. Right? That trinary switch works in parallel with your engine temperature switch. They both control the same relay. That way, either engine temperature or AC pressure will turn on your fan. Same fans. All right? That's the proper way to hook up an electric fan in a system. That's the only right way. There's a diagram of this in the back of the catalog, back of our catalog, how to do this. That's the way you want the system run. We still have people out there, we still have fan manufacturers that want to turn on that electric fan every time the compressor's engaged. Every time they turn the AC on, they want to turn the fan on. Why would you do that? Your fan has a finite life, doesn't it? Any electric motor has a finite life. Why would you run it when it doesn't need to run? Now, when you're going down the road 70 miles an hour, what do you think's giving you more airflow, a fan or the ram air? We talked about it before, ram air, right? So why would you have your fan on every time your compressor's on? In addition, we've done testing, and a lot of times running that fan causes turbulence and actually reduces the airflow through the radiator and condenser at higher speeds. Let the air find its way through. So if you use a trinary switch and a set point engine temperature switch, both controlling the same fan relay, the car tells you when it needs more airflow. Because either the AC pressure is too high or the engine temperature is too high. And you may get a customer that asks you to say, well, when am I ever going to need the trinary switch? The engine temperature is going to be up there. Stop and think about it. You've been at a car show all day, or you've been sitting all day. You come out of work, the car's been sitting all day. It's, to use an AC term, it's heat soaked. It's all hot inside the car. What's the first thing you do when you get in the car? Turn the air on, right? I do. When it's 100 degrees in Texas, I get in the car, it's been sitting out there. First thing I do, max cool. Okay, so now what am I doing? I'm absorbing a whole lot of heat inside this car, pulling it out, pushing it to the condenser, and I've got all that pressure and all that heat in the condenser, right? Immediately. If I don't have that fan spinning, you're not going to get rid of that heat, and it's going to start shutting the compressor off. What about your engine temperature at that point? Your engine temperature is not hot enough to kick that fan on yet. So that's where that trinary switch is so important to you. And this is what the OEMs do now with any of their systems. If you start up, if you got a late model vehicle and you start it up and everything, about the first thing you're going to see after you turn on the AC in about 20, 30 seconds, the fan's going to start. We did a demonstration at our dealer meeting just not too long ago. We have an engine all set up on a test stand and everything. And it's 70-degree weather. If you turn on the AC, in about 20 seconds, that fan's going to come on, if not less. Because if without that airflow through the condenser to get rid of that heat, that pressure goes up dramatically, almost instantly. But the advantage of a trinary, in conjunction with your engine temperature, lets the system tell you when it needs more airflow. Right? Does that make sense to everybody? And this is, again, a real common question. I'm trying to work with some of these fan manufacturers to try to get them to see the logic here. And it's pretty good logic, isn't it, when you think about it again. Why would you run the fan when you're running down the highway? You don't need to. Let the engine tell you. Let the AC tell you when it needs more airflow. Now, let's let's talk about some basics also then. Which evaporator are you going to use in your car? Pretty easy answer. Biggest one you can. Biggest one you can. And now it's a little more clear why, right? Give a good example. I have a big room like this. Now, what would happen if I put a little window unit over there in the wall? I'd feel some cool air coming out of that window unit, right? But it wouldn't cool the room. Same thing happens, we get this question all the time. The worst thing you can absolutely do is wait till the end to put AC in your car. You know, if you're designing a car, if you're working on a car, AC is the third thing I do. I get the steering column where it needs to be, I get the brake pedals where they need to be, the brake and clutch pedal where they need to be, an accelerator pedal, and then I set the air conditioner, because then I use the largest one I can, and I've got that package space reserved for that. And the reason for that is that evaporator is what's absorbing the heat. The larger the coil, the more heat absorption capacity it has, right? So that's why you want to always use the largest evaporator you can. Which condenser do you want to use? Biggest one you can, right? The largest one you can. The larger the condenser, the better the ability it's going to have to reject that heat, to get rid of that heat, to dissipate that heat. Okay? So that's why it's so important to consider these things when you're building a car. Yes, sir. Yeah, you got to have, again, they work in tandem. He asked if there's a size relationship between evaporator and condenser. If you have a great big evaporator coil, and this comes into play most often when you start talking, there's always a question about dual systems, right? Guys talking about, you've got a great big wagon, and I want to put dual systems in there. Now what happens if I put two evaporators with one small condenser? Ain't going to work, right? Now you see why that won't work. You've got two evaporators absorbing heat from inside a large car. You've got to have enough condenser capacity to dissipate that heat, or it's not going to work satisfactorily. You can have two AC units, but they're going to be shutting off half the time with a safety switch because you're building up so much pressure in the condenser. I very rarely have ever seen too much condenser on a car, especially a hot rod of any kind, because you're limited by space. So you want to use the largest condenser you can, largest evaporator you can. And you know, with our SureFit kits, that's what we do. Use the largest coil possible, largest condenser possible. So, I mean, I can give you the mathematical relationships, but it's not going to, I mean, again, largest ones you can. I mean, you would want no less than 300 square inches of a parallel flow of that condenser in a car. That's about a minimum. 300 square inches of a parallel flow, and that's with a 3/4 inch coil, or a 3/4 inch tube thickness. But, rule of thumb, biggest you can. Biggest you can, evaporator and condenser. You're never going to over-condense. You're not going to have too much condenser. Exactly. It comes down to it. Okay? It does. That's one of those cases. Now, another thing that I want to give you a hint on here, too, that's important, is it's important on how you mount a condenser. What's heavier, liquid or gas? Liquid, right? So where would we want the liquid on our condenser? Bottom, right? So with a condenser, you've got two different size lines here. You've got a number 8 on top, which is a larger line, and you've got a number 6 on the bottom, which is a smaller line. You've got a high-pressure gas going in there. We're putting it through this condenser, taking the heat away from it, condensing it to a liquid. We want the liquid on the bottom, the number 6 on the bottom. What happens if you reverse that? It's not going to work as well, right? Because you've got the gas coming in, condensing, and now you're building up pressure. You're going to get excess pressure, and the system's not going to cool properly. So easy way to remember that, right? I had a guy when I was first learning this, I had an old guy that I worked for that was teaching me about AC. Got a young lady here and stuff. The guy told me then, forgive me for this. The guy told me, he said, I'm going to tell you, because I installed one upside down first thing. He said, when you're out looking for a wife, he said, you want to find one big on top and small on the bottom. I never forgot it after that. You know, when you're out there looking, you got big shoulders and a small waist, right? See, that's it. Big on top, small on bottom. You're never going to forget it again, I promise you. But it's very critical. And again, you can see why. You know, and again, there's nothing we've talked about here that's difficult, right? It's just simple. It's simple. But make 2 or 3 of these small mistakes. There's nothing that frustrates me more than being at a car show somewhere, being at an event, and having a guy come up and say, I've had one of your systems in my car for 3 years, never has worked right. And you're talking to me now? You know, I'll tell you, that is one advantage I think that is really good for our company is our sales and tech guys on the phone. Now, I'm not telling you we never make a mistake, because it can happen to anybody. But 99.9% of the time when somebody calls up with a problem, we're trying to figure out what they did wrong. Because 99% of the time, it's not something with the system. It's something with it's this guy. That's what we're trying to figure out. And it's the same way with you, because now you can see it's 1 or 2 little small things. You know, you got the dryer in backwards. You've got the condenser upside down. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a condenser upside down or sideways. So now you've got a high pressure gas going in trying to push upwards and then go over and come down. You get oil problems, you get oil separation problems, you've got all kinds of issues that come up with that, okay? Another thing I want to touch on real quickly, and that's all we're going to get to probably here, is when you're dealing with 134A refrigerant, like what we use standard, there's 2 things about 134A that are very critical. Number 1, the molecules of 134A versus R12 are very, very small. R12 refrigerant molecules are like this. 134A are very tiny. So it's imperative that you use O-ring fittings and the proper crimp on hoses when you're working with 134A. Because if you don't, you're going to have leaks come up. You're going to get, and once you have leaks, the system doesn't work right. 134A is extremely charge sensitive. And when I say that, that's just a fancy way of saying you got to use the right amount. And the OEMs have learned this over time. Anybody have a car when, you know, anybody know when did the federal government mandate 134A? 90 what? 95. Okay, you were closest. What size t-shirt you were? Extra large. Okay, 95. And what the OEMs did, did anybody have a car in 95 and were not happy with the AC on it? I did. 134A now works pretty damn good, doesn't it? Yeah, because the OEMs figured out what it took to make that system work properly. They took 134A, dumped it into a system designed for R12, and it didn't work well. And one of the things that's so critical in 134A is you have to charge properly. Remember the old days of that sight glass on top of the dryer? Anybody ever look at a sight glass to see if the bubbles in there and stuff? You know, that wasn't the right way to charge with R12, but we got away with it because it wasn't as charge sensitive. With 134A, if you see bubbles in a system, in the top of the dryer here, those bubbles are actually oil molecules that have not completely dissolved because the 134A molecules are so small. So those are oil droplets. I can get rid of those bubbles. You know how? I fill that dryer full of liquid. You won't see any bubbles in liquid, but it's way overcharged at this point. But I charged it till I don't have any more. Another thing that'll get you in a huge amount of trouble with 134A is using those nice little Pep Boys or AutoZone or O'Reilly charge kits. And they have a little green gauge on them. Have you seen that? The only problem with those is those are designed for late model systems and some systems in cars that use you'd referred to a fixed orifice tube instead of an expansion valve. The low side pressure on a fixed orifice tube system is about 26 to 28 psi. The low side pressures that we look for on an expansion valve dryer system, anybody know? 15 to 18. So if I charge my expansion valve system and I'm watching the low side of the gauge, the low pressure side of the gauge, and I charge it till I'm at about 26, I'm overcharged. I'm not going to get good system operation. I want that to be down in the lower end for it to. When I've got 15 to 18 psi on the low side, I know what the temperature in the coil is because I know a pressure temperature curve of the gas. At 15 to 18, I know that's in the high 30s to low 40s. Has to be. Just physical characteristics. So you've got to use the right amount. You've got to either use a charging station or a digital scale. Good experiment I always do when I rent a car these days or something, I always go into the hood and I'm looking to see what the OEMs are doing with their systems. Toyotas and all of them anymore, you'll notice their charges are less than a pound for a lot of these. And they'll be 0.95 pounds of refrigerant plus or minus 0.01. Pretty tight. Yes. Now, I got a quick question for you, too. Where are we going to get the coldest air temperature coming speed, medium speed, high speed? Good. That's right, low speed. Why? More time in the coil. More time in the coil for that heat to be taken out of that, right? That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, one of the problems we talked about with freeze-up that we run into is everybody gets in the car, they turn the car on, they put the AC on max cold, they turn the thermostat up. Now it starts getting cool in the car, so what's the first thing we do? Start kicking back the blower speed, right? But we don't adjust the thermostat at all. So now, all of a sudden the system's freezing up. Well, what we've done now, the colder that air gets and going through there, you're just turning the blower down, the air's spending more time in the coil, getting colder and colder, and that's when you start getting your freeze up. The proper way to do it is you start getting cooler, kick that thermostat back a little bit, and then it won't freeze up on you. Right, so that's important to do. Yes, sir? No, the oil is supplied in the compressor. We use nothing but Sandin compressors, and a Sandin 508 compressor, a standard 508 compressor has 7.2 ounces of PAG oil, which is polyalkylene glycol oil. That's all the system needs. You don't want to add oil charge. If you're using another brand of compressor, you've got to check with the compressor manufacturer. Some are shipped dry. Some are shipped dry, and then you've got to find out from that compressor manufacturer what they recommend.
Same with the dryer.
Yeah, dryer you don't add anything to. Yep. All the oil you need is in the compressor. That's all you need in a system is in the compressor. You don't want to add any oil. If you add oil, you're going to be overcharged, and that happens very common. That's another thing. You know, I even changed the way my salesmen ask questions. You know, again, I used to ask my son, "Did you leave the light on upstairs?" "No, not me, Dad. He's an only child. If I didn't and my wife didn't, I know who left it on." But, you know, same way if you ask somebody, they'd have all the symptoms of an overcharge, and we used to ask them, "Did you add oil to the system?" "No, not me, you didn't add oil." So now what we do is, how much oil did you add to the system? It sounds like that. You know what, if you're a guy for the first time, if you ask it that way, they're more inclined, I added a couple ounces, is that okay? No, it's not. You've got an overcharge situation here, okay? And if the guy didn't add oil, he'll use, "Oh, no, was I supposed to?" You say, "No, you weren't." That's good, but you don't want to add oil. If it's a new system, that Sandin compressor has all the oil you need. On a repair system like that, I'll generally, if it's just leaked all the refrigerant out, I may generally add an ounce of oil, something like that, with a new dryer and when you've repaired it. I mean, the proper way to do it, if you're doing it the proper way, you'd pull the compressor off, drain the compressor of all the oil, and figure what's good. When, if you've got 6 ounces of oil, you've lost 1.2, you can figure probably half an ounce in the system, so you'd add about a half an ounce. So I may add a half an ounce. It's better to be a little low than too much. Same with refrigerant. You're better to be a little low on refrigerant than too much. If you add too much, pressure goes up, efficiency in cooling goes down. So if you go somewhere to have a system charged and the guy is looking at the sight glass, you're in the wrong place. He's going to get you in trouble. And one last thing I'll close with on this, I didn't get to anything on our products, but we can do that anytime, is evacuation. The system has to be properly evacuated, a new system, before you charge it. And we're doing two things when we evacuate the system. First thing is we're pulling air out of the system, okay? What's the second thing we're doing? Taking the moisture out of the system, okay? And how are we getting the moisture out of the system? By creating a vacuum. What does a vacuum do to the boiling point of water? Lowers it. Lowers it. So you're boiling the moisture out of the system, right, is what you're doing. Okay, so that's what we're doing. You've got to evacuate the system to get the moisture out of it and pull the air out of it prior to charging. We still get this, again, a guy will do a whole system installation, and he goes to Pep Boys or he goes to O'Reilly's and he gets him one of those charge kits and just tries to charge the system. Isn't going to work.